Welcome, I'm Krueger.
Thanks for having me.
So you took part in the session, A Labor Market for All. So can you tell us, why is France's labor market such a concern today?
Well, France is not unique, but France, I think, is exhibiting many of the problems that other economies are having. Youth unemployment is unacceptably high. Overall unemployment rate remains above 10%. France has done a better job than many countries in terms of weathering the rise in inequality, but in France as well as other countries, inequality has been rising. So I think the main challenge for France is to make the labor market more inclusive, to make the labor market work better for young people, for immigrants, and for those who have a lower level of skills.
What do you think that means within the European Union, though?
Well, that's a very complicated question, and the European Union is evolving, as you know. I think that France and Germany are the center of gravity of the European Union, and I think it's very important that their economies are strong. And really, there's no model economy in the European Union now. I don't think there's any particular country where I'd say this country is getting everything right. So I think there's a lot of room for improvement, and I think that for France in particular, the government needs to focus on reforming the labor market to make the labor market more inclusive.
You talk about reforming, which is definitely what we need here. And in April you said that the US economy was recovering and that the labor market was shifting into new gear. What would France need to do to enjoy the same benefits?
I think France needs more flexibility in terms of hiring, lower firing costs, easier ability for companies to start up, for entrepreneurs to start new companies, including high-tech companies. That's where I would focus a lot of attention in France.
Don't you think, though, there's a need to maybe reform the education system as well?
Education is very important in the current environment. Workers who have a higher level of education are faring better around the world. They're able to adapt to the changes that are sweeping the world economy. But education is not sufficient. And education tends to be a more long-run solution. I think that educational reforms are certainly worth pursuing, but I think of even greater priority for France is improving the functioning of the labor market.
And you mentioned immigration. How should, with all that's happening today in Europe, I mean, the immigration crisis is huge. We've hardly ever seen that before. Do you think there should be some sort of program of integration of these refugees so that maybe that could help thrive the European market and France's as well? Absolutely.
I think in the Euro area, the problem with refugees and immigrants is very different than in the US. And in the US, we also have tensions. But in the US, historically, immigrants have managed to assimilate rather rapidly and to make the US economy more dynamic, to bring innovation to the economy, to make sectors more competitive. If you look back over the history of the US, many of the great companies and innovations were founded by immigrants who were less tied to the current way of doing things. And I think in France in particular, the immigrant population is too isolated. And I would look for housing policies to try to integrate immigrants. And I would also pursue a strategy of emphasizing the benefits of immigration. I don't think we do enough job explaining to our publics in both of our countries how our nations have historically benefited from immigrants. In the US, it's a little bit easier because we are a nation of immigrants, because everyone can trace their roots to immigrants in the US. That's more difficult, I think, in Europe, but I think it's equally important to have an ethic that immigration helps to build stronger economies. And I would add, especially in an era when we have slow population growth and slow productivity growth.
And as I mentioned, it's a European crisis, the refugee crisis right now. I mean, it's a world crisis, obviously, but they tend to come to Europe for this. And do you think maybe, whether it's in Europe or the European Union, because we need to talk about this, do you think maybe there should be some sort of scheme whether it's education or improving the labor market in general, to facilitate the cooperation between the countries?
I think that would certainly help. I would look to community organizations to help to integrate and assimilate immigrants. And I would appeal to the general public, to their better angels, to look at how many wonderful success stories there are with immigrants. In the US now, the most popular play is called Hamilton, about Alexander Hamilton, who was one of the founding fathers of our country and first Treasury Secretary. And I have to say, I worked at the Treasury Department in the US, and I didn't fully appreciate Alexander Hamilton's contributions to our country. And the fact that this show is really sweeping the country, I think is an indication of how much support there could be for enlightened immigration policy when people appreciate the role that immigration has played in building up their countries.
So change is to be expected, and maybe that will come in France and Europe then?
Well, that would be the optimistic scenario. I think the world is really at a tipping point now where it can go into a more inclusive direction, one where we have shared growth, one which supports the most vulnerable, including refugees, or one which appeals to our worst instincts and tries to close the world out in terms of both trade and immigration. And I think if you look around the world, we're very much at a tipping point. Unfortunately, the election in Great Britain tipped the wrong way by a pretty narrow margin. And sadly, when you look at it, the youth, who are the future of the country, were very much in favor of remaining in the European Union.
There's still hope. Let's finish on a good note. There will still be hope in Europe.
Well, I hope that other member states view the difficulties that the UK is currently going through as a warning. And I think, and this is also relevant for the US, elections have consequences. It's not just about throwing the leaders out or sending a signal or shaking things up. I think people need to be smart when they cast their ballot because it determines the future of the country. And these are not easy issues. Having experience, having an understanding of the issues, and a demonstrated ability to reflect the best advice that you could get and to be diplomatic, I think are extremely important. And I think our political institutions have been failing us, which is the final point I'll make. There's been a lot of discussion about populism around the world and the rise of nationalist instincts. To some extent, I think that those latent interests were always there, but the political system constrained them. In the US, the Republican Party had a fatal failure in allowing Donald Trump to become their nominee. He doesn't represent the best of the party. In fact, many longtime Republicans say he's not a Republican at all. And I think there was a failure in the institution which allowed someone who is manifestly unqualified to be President of the United States to be the candidate for president. Likewise, in Great Britain, I think David Cameron made a fatal mistake, cost him his job in the end, to allow a referendum on such an important decision where it's irreversible in many respects, although hopefully they will come to their senses and reverse it. He should have had a process which had a higher threshold than 50%. He could have had a multi-step process where a 50% referendum automatically requires Parliament to vote on the issue, but he could have put in some checks and balances. And I think that's a failure of our political institutions. And I think one lesson I take away from this is we need to look hard at our political institutions to make sure that they reflect the best of our history and the best practices and don't lead to decisions that large numbers of people will live to regret.
Well, thank you very much, Krueger, for this interview.
Thanks for having me.